All right. Hey guys, welcome back. This is part 2 of lesson 2, Progressives Drive Reform in Unit 3, the Progressive Era. Please remember to have your journals out and pick up where we left off. We were talking about the muckrakers. These were investigative journalists who sought to bring the horrible truths happening in society to light so that people would know what was happening and society could start to make things different. This fits into the larger progressive narrative because remember, progressives, middle class, usually urban white reformers, they were trying to make things better. Progressive journalists like the muckrakers will help them do that. Probably the most famous of the muckrakers was Upton Sinclair with his book, The Jungle. And remember, that's referring to the urban jungle because he did his investigative journalism on the meatpacking industry, particularly in Chicago. They had horrible things going into the meat, human fingers, rat poison, rats themselves. They were selling months old sausage that was glycerined up with stuff you make soap out of, basically to make it look new and appealing, even though it was rancid, terribly rotten meat. When his book comes out about these horrors, the things that was going into the meat, people were understandably horrified. And the government will respond with a progressive president like Teddy Roosevelt by introducing new legislation like the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act to make things safer for consumers, the people eating the meat. Upton Sinclair said he aimed for the public's heart, but he ended up hitting the stomach instead. Other muckrakers you should know about include guys like Jacob Riis. He wrote this book called How the Other Half Lives. It's a study about the tenements in the big cities, like in New York City. Remember, a tenement was a very poor, very crowded house where typically many immigrants or other urban poor would end up. At a tenement house, you could expect it to be in the poorer part of the city near factories where many of its inhabitants worked. You could expect that an entire family, including extended family like cousins, aunts and uncles, grandparents, would all be living in the same apartment. And this was, to call it an apartment, being pretty generous. It was like one room and it was extremely filthy, extremely crowded. There's no room for anything, communal bathrooms, very unsanitary, very poor. This is the poor housing, basically. His book showed how they lived. And there was a far cry from what most of the middle class Americans at this time were living. It also showed many pictures of not just the hallways in the tenements and the rooms, but also on the streets, in the gutters, in the alleyways, the homeless situation. And particularly striking was the homeless poor, like these children pictured here. Now they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. One thing that the muckraker, the investigative journalist Jacob Riis, R-I-I-S, did that was different from other muckrakers at this time, make sure you highlight his name, was that he took a lot of pictures and put that into his book. So he's kind of like a photojournalist, a muckraking photojournalist. Ida Tarbell, in her book, she's also a muckraker, it was called The History of Standard Oil, and she went after John D. Rockefeller, the richest man in America, and his big monopoly, Standard Oil, the big oil monopoly. He had built up his company, remember, by horizontal integration, by basically wiping out the competition. He had cutthroat business tactics where he would undersell his product and push the competition out where they couldn't match his prices. And then as soon as they went under, he would buy them up. And his tentacled member monster, the Standard Oil machine, it is basically, this company is going to buy out all the other oil companies in America until it's the only one controlling most of the oil in our entire nation. So he definitely had a monopoly. She writes about how he did this, his unfair practices, his cutthroat techniques, how he would push out the competition, and is eventually going to be able to get this published, which is going to lead to Congress and our governments, again, not being laissez-faire, being the opposite, being progressive, being hands-on. It's going to lead to the passage of this law called the Clayton Antitrust Act. Please highlight. Now earlier, I think we talked about this in the Gilded Age, there was the Sherman Antitrust Act. Remember, that was the first time that government had tried to regulate monopolies and basically say that, hey, you can't have one business controlling all the others. That's really wrong. It hurts consumers because you're hurting prices, because the monopoly can set prices whatever they want. and you're hurting your workers. There's no competition. There's no incentive for you to be better to them. Monopolies in general, there's no competition at all. So there's no incentive for products to be better. In general, monopolies, they hurt pretty much everybody but the person who owns the monopolies. So that was the first attempt to try to get rid of monopolies, but it wasn't very effective. And it actually ended up hurting the workers more than it did like the robber barons. So it was totally not a good thing. It's going to be used to more effect. It'll be kind of dusted off and used a lot better during this time period under presidents like Teddy Roosevelt. And then we're going to add to it this new law due to Ida Tarbell's book, Attacking Standard Oil. This new law was the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is actually going to be a lot stronger at curtailing the power of the monopolies. It's going to specifically go after Standard Oil, which under the administration of Taft, is going to be broken up into many smaller oil companies. Today, like ExxonMobil, the Exxon gas stations, that is a remnant of what used to be the big giant Standard Oil company. But basically, it's going to break up the monopolies. And the other thing and it's going to not allow monopolies to form basically using those corrupt practices like the underselling, the cutthroat competition. It's going to get rid of some of those practices. And it's going to protect labor unions. So there was a lot in the Clayton Antitrust Act. Make sure you highlight it. And remember also what that earlier Antitrust Act was, the Sherman. In general, when it says antitrust, it means anti-monopoly. We're trying to break up the monopolies, to trust bust. The social gospel movement highlighted, this is when good Christians are encouraged to donate and give to charities, to give to those less fortunate. This is a big idea by proponents like Andrew Carnegie, the wealthy industrialist. You know, he's kind of considered a robber baron. Remember Homestead Steel and what happened to those workers there with the Pinkertons? But he did believe in giving back. He had himself been a poor, Scottish immigrant, new to America as a young man, just trying to make it for himself and his family. And he could appreciate what the poor were going through. So he wanted to use his immense wealth to give back. Remember, that's when you are a philanthropist. You give back to those less fortunate. To be fair, Rockefeller also was a philanthropist. He gave back a lot of his wealth as well, but they had so much money. I mean, they didn't get back all of it. But the social gospel movement, you think gospel, you think the Bible. This is about good Christians doing good works. And Andrew Carnegie, in his Gospel of Wealth, will talk about the idea that if you are wealthy, you have a responsibility to give back. It's the right thing to do, but also if you want to end up in the good place, you got to give back. Don't be hanging on to your wealth when you die, or you'll end up in the HE double hockey sticks downstairs. Okay. A wonderful progressive reformer during this time period was this woman named Jane Addams, spelled with 2 D's. So that's like the da-da-da-da, 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 da-da-da-da. It's like that Adams, not like the Adams family that had the John Adams, 2nd president, and John Quincy Adams, 6th president. This is like Adams family Adams, but she wasn't from the crazy Adams family. Jane Addams was actually from a very wealthy urban family in Chicago, and she is going to use her family's immense fortune. She travels all through Europe. She speaks many different languages. She's a very accomplished, very wealthy woman who was a reformer. She was a progressive. She wants to help the urban poor, especially the immigrants who came to America with so little opportunities, who didn't speak the language, who found themselves having to resort to these lives living in tenements, working in factories. She wants to do something to help them. So she founds what's called the settlement house. This will become known as like the whole houses. Make sure you highlight that right there in your notes. Highlight her name, Jane Addams. A whole house was a halfway home. It was a place where people who were poor or homeless in the cities, especially children, could go, where they would have a roof over their heads. They'd be provided with shelter, a bed to sleep in, and most importantly, they would be provided with educational lessons where they would learn skills that they would need in order to have opportunities in America. The most important among these lessons would be learning English so that they could get better jobs. And so that is what her whole houses did. And by doing this, Jane Addams kind of also started her own, well, not her own, but basically a major profession in the world today. She became like the first social worker. So the entire field of like social work sort of began with Jane Addams. Okay, and the last topic today before we get to some important laws is I want to mention this thing that happened right around, it was the time period that Titanic sank, around 1911, 1912. There was this major fire in downtown New York City at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. It was this 10-story office building there in downtown, and a fire broke out. Now, what they did there at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, it was a textile factory. They would sew together clothing. So there's lots of cloth all over the floor, all over the place. So lots of things that were very flammable could catch fire easily. Most of the workers at this factory were young women, many of them immigrants. They were about your age. They were 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, young teenage immigrant women working in the like 9th, 10th, very top floors of this factory. They were stitching and sewing and using the sewing machines to put together clothing here. Well, fire breaks out. Maybe somebody's smoking. They put their cigarette in the trash can with some other, used cloth, and it catches fire. However it starts, the fire quickly spreads. Now, the factory owners, like many factory owners at this time, they did not like their workers taking breaks. They did not like these women. They did not afford them many opportunities to take breaks. So they would lock the doors to this factory from the outside. So these women, when the fire is raging, they're literally trapped inside there. Now the elevator, there was just one elevator. Its doors basically, can only go so fast, and it can only hold so much weight. Eventually, if all these women stampeding to try to escape this fire before they burn to death, the elevator breaks, and it kills some of those who were in it when it breaks. But that was their only means of escape. The fire escapes themselves on the sides of the building. If you've ever been to a big city, you've seen the fire escapes outside the building's windows. That's where they have these little like metal stairs. They were rusted through and broken. So literally these women were trapped up in the 9th and 10th stories. Some of them try to get up to the rooftop and jump to other buildings. Some of them will simply just pray to God and burn to death, a very, very terrible, very painful way to die. And then others, very bravely, these young 16-year-old girls, they would go to the windows, and rather than burn to death, they would try to take their luck by jumping out the window, out the 10-story window, down straight onto the concrete below. And just people outside, this is downtown New York City, people gathered, they tried to have, stretched tents and stuff they could use as trampolines to catch them, but nothing seemed to work. The fire brigade was not prepared for this. Their hoses, the water couldn't reach up to the 10th story. And these people are just helpless to do anything as these young women just go splat, splat, splat. Their bodies, they're dying instantly on the concrete below. It was horrifying. It was one of the most horrifying events in our history, just because it was so public. And it was these young women, these innocent young girls. So because of this terrible tragedy, there will be many workplace reforms, not only fire safety reforms, but also there's a renewed emphasis on, the terrible cost of big business owners mistreating their employees. As far as fire safety regulations go, we'll get better standards for, extinguishers, there we go. And for fire brigades, making sure hoses can reach up high enough and that there were enough hydrants located at stations where they should be around the city on the streets. That there would be also, working multiple escape means, multiple escape exits and stuff, and sprinkler systems and other things. So that was the Triangle Shirtwaist fire. That was in, like I said, around the time that the Titanic famously sank. I think this was 1911, 1912. Okay. The last thing in our notes, we're talking about progressives wanting to help the poor, do their parts, make society better. One of the key ways to do this is to have more people be more involved in their government. This is what progressives want. They want more democracy, more direct action in the government. And so some of the reforms, some of the fixes that they get will include the direct primary system. This is where in the springtime before the general election, like what happened in the spring in 2020 that we just saw, the Democrats will choose from among themselves in a series of elections in every state their primary candidate, their nominee for the Democratic Party. Likewise, the Republicans will do the same. That's the primary elections. They're called primary because primary means first. The secondary is called the general elections, and that takes place in the fall, in November, when we're going to see our elections for president and Congress and these other positions. Another way that progressives are going to seek to make sure that people have more say in their government is the initiative, referendum, and recall process. Now, this isn't in every state. Like, for instance, in Texas, we only have the referendum. But I'm going to go through each one, and you need to make sure you highlight these in your notes and write anything extra so you can remember them, because this is one of the things, honestly, that my students every year on the STAR test really struggle with remembering when it comes to May. So the first one, the initiative. This is when people make their own laws, okay? To initiate something means to start something. If you have an idea, a proposal for a new law that we should have in our society to make things better, in certain states like California, you can, as a private citizen, write a new law, like a petition for this law to become actual reality, okay? That is the initiative, to, as a citizen, make your own law. The referendum, that is when the people of like a state get to vote on their own laws. Like I said, in Texas, we can do this with particular laws, usually with those that are going to be amended to our state constitution. So state constitutional amendments, the citizens of Texas get to vote on. When we, the people of the states, get to vote on laws, that is a referendum process. We get to participate directly by voting on laws. And then finally, the recall. Have you ever heard of like those cell phones a few years ago that were like exploding because the batteries were corrosive? Or like many years ago, the famous Firestone tire affair. The tires had a malfunction and lots of people were having wrecks and dying because of those faulty tires. So they had to do a recall. Likewise, they had to recall those cell phones. So when you recall something, you're taking it back. The recall in politics is when there's a bad politician. They're doing bad things. They need to be recalled or kicked out of office, called back. And so a recall in certain states, that's where like the people in the state of California, again, they could actually vote to kick out of office a bad politician. Now I know what you're thinking. You're like, well, does that apply to the president? Could the people of the United States vote to recall the president? No, because remember, the presidency is described in the Constitution, which is our highest law. According to Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, it's the highest authority in our entire nation over the state governments, over everything else, the Constitution. And in Article 2, the Constitution, where it talks about the executive branch, it talks about how the president, in Article 1, the legislative branch, how he can be recalled. That's called the impeachment process. That's what Congress has the power to do. That's one of their checking powers. And then also a quick reminder, from the Populist Party, we got the 17th Amendment. That's the direct election of United States senators. Before the 17th Amendment, which ratifies in like 1916, I think, or it's around 1913, 1916. I can't remember when it ratifies. But before this, the state legislatures, the state governments would actually choose the United States senators. There's 2 from every state. After the ratification of the 17th Amendment, now it's the people of the states, like, you know, myself and you guys, when you'll become 18, when you get to be able to vote, we're the ones who now can actually vote directly for our United States senators, just like we do for our representatives to the House, our congressmen. So these are all ways in which democracy, or people's ability to affect their government, expanded and became greater during the progressive era. Make sure you highlight each one and you know what it's talking about. Now that is the end of our lesson 2 notes for the progressive era. So please make sure you go back and look at that essential question. How did progressives seek reform during this era? And talk to me in your summary, now at the end of your notes, about all the ways that progressives were trying to fix society during this time period. All right, thank you guys so much. Hope you have a good day.